The night the kindness happened, the rain came down in sheets, thick and relentless, the kind that makes the city feel smaller and heavier at the same time. Daniel Harper sat alone on a bus bench outside Mercy General Hospital, his shoulders hunched, his coat soaked through, staring at the cracked concrete beneath his feet. The fluorescent lights from the hospital entrance flickered behind him, casting a pale glow that felt cold rather than comforting. Inside those walls, his life had quietly broken apart. 3 hours earlier, a doctor had told him that his younger sister, Emily, wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. The accident on the interstate had been sudden, brutal, and unfair. A drunk driver, a twisted guardrail, a phone call that changed everything. Daniel had driven straight from his job at the warehouse without even stopping to change, his hands still smelling faintly of oil and cardboard. Now he felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything solid inside him and left only weight. Daniel had always believed in working through pain by staying busy. He worked overtime, he paid his bills, he didn't complain. Kindness, to him, had always been something soft people talked about when life was easy. Pain, on the other hand, was real. Pain was loud and demanding. And right now, pain was winning. He didn't notice the old man at first. The bench creaked slightly as someone sat down at the far end, far enough to respect space, close enough to be present. The man wore a worn brown jacket and held an umbrella that looked like it had survived decades of storms. For a while, neither of them spoke. Rain drummed on the umbrella, the pavement, the city itself. "Hard night?" the man finally asked, his voice low and steady. Daniel almost didn't answer. He had no energy for small talk. But something about the man's tone, no pity, no pressure, made him nod. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You could say that." The man waited, not pushing. "Hospital nights are the longest," he said after a moment. "They stretch time in strange ways." Daniel glanced at him, surprised. "You been here a lot?" The man smiled faintly. "More than I ever wanted." He adjusted the umbrella slightly so it covered both of them. "Name's Arthur." "Daniel." Another pause. Then the words spilled out of Daniel before he could stop them. The accident, the doctors, the waiting, the fear that his sister, the one person who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, might never open her eyes again. He spoke in fragments, his voice cracking, rain mixing with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. Arthur listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice or cliches. When Daniel finally fell silent, embarrassed by how much he'd said to a stranger, Arthur simply nodded. "You know," Arthur said gently, "pain has a way of convincing us we're alone." "It lies very well." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Feels pretty convincing right now." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is going to sound strange," he said, "but I'd like you to have this." Daniel hesitated. "What is it?" "An address," Arthur replied. "And a time." "Tomorrow morning." Daniel frowned. "I don't think I'm in the mood for errands." Arthur smiled again, not offended. "You don't have to go. It's just an invitation. Years ago, someone gave me one when I was sitting exactly where you are now." Rain continued to fall between them. Daniel looked at the paper but didn't take it. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Arthur's eyes reflected the hospital lights. "I lost my wife and son in a fire. Same night, same hour." Daniel's breath caught. "I'm sorry." Arthur nodded. "I was angry at the world for a long time. Then a stranger showed me kindness I didn't think I deserved. It didn't erase the pain, but it changed what the pain could do to me." Slowly, Daniel took the paper. "What's at the address?" "A community kitchen," Arthur said. "They serve breakfast. They always need extra hands." Daniel almost laughed at the idea. "You want me to help other people when I can barely breathe?" Arthur stood, opening his umbrella fully. "I want you to remember that pain isn't the end of your story. Sometimes kindness beyond pain is what keeps us alive long enough to heal." Before Daniel could respond, Arthur nodded once and walked into the rain, disappearing into the dark street. Daniel sat there long after, the paper clenched in his fist, feeling something unfamiliar beneath the grief. Not hope, not yet, but a crack in the wall pain had built around him. The next morning, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat by Emily's bedside until dawn, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, listening to machines hum softly. When the sun finally crept through the window, he remembered Arthur's words. On impulse he didn't fully understand, Daniel left the hospital, unfolded the paper, and drove across town. The building was modest, tucked between a closed laundromat and a tire shop. Inside, the smell of coffee and eggs filled the air. Volunteers moved with quiet purpose, greeting one another like family. A woman with gray-streaked hair handed Daniel an apron without asking questions. "Glad you're here," she said simply. Daniel spent the morning washing dishes, serving plates, refilling cups. He barely spoke, yet with every small task, something inside him shifted. The pain was still there, heavy and sharp, but it no longer consumed every inch of him. For the first time since the accident, Daniel felt useful. When he left, exhausted and strangely lighter, he understood what Arthur had meant. One act of kindness, offered freely, without expectation, had changed something fundamental. Not the circumstances, not the loss, but the direction his life was facing. And that made all the difference. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel found himself returning to the community kitchen whenever he could. At first it was just a distraction, something to fill the long hours of waiting at the hospital. Emily remained unconscious, suspended in that fragile space between life and uncertainty. Doctors spoke carefully, choosing words that neither promised nor denied. Daniel learned to live inside that ambiguity, carrying it like a weight in his chest. At the kitchen, though, time moved differently. People came in with stories written on their faces: fatigue, resilience, shame, gratitude. Daniel learned names, learned who liked extra sugar in their coffee and who preferred silence over conversation. He discovered that kindness didn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it was just remembering someone mattered. One morning, he noticed a young woman sitting alone at a corner table, her hands shaking as she tried to eat. She couldn't have been older than 20. Daniel brought her a napkin without saying a word. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, like the words were fragile. That simple exchange stayed with him all day. He realized he hadn't heard anyone thank him in weeks. Not at the hospital, not at work, not even from himself. Yet here, in this unremarkable building, gratitude flowed easily. The phone call came late one afternoon while Daniel was drying trays. His heart dropped the moment he saw the hospital number. He stepped outside, bracing himself for bad news. Instead, the nurse's voice was bright. "Your sister opened her eyes," she said. She squeezed the doctor's hand. Daniel slid down the wall, tears blurring everything. Relief crashed into him so hard he laughed and cried at the same time. When he returned inside, the volunteers cheered without fully understanding why. The woman with gray-streaked hair hugged him, apron and all. That night, Daniel sat by Emily's bed again, this time holding her hand as her eyes fluttered weakly open. She couldn't speak yet, but she looked at him with recognition, with love. In that moment, Daniel felt the full weight of what kindness had done. Not just Arthur's kindness, but the kindness he had been allowed to give and receive. Recovery was slow. Emily faced months of therapy. Daniel balanced work, hospital visits, and volunteering, often exhausted to the bone. But he noticed something remarkable. The pain no longer felt like an enemy trying to destroy him. It had become something he carried with purpose. One evening, weeks later, Daniel spotted Arthur at the kitchen, quietly stirring a pot of soup. Their eyes met, and Arthur smiled like he'd been expecting him all along. "You came," Arthur said. Daniel nodded. "You were right." Arthur chuckled softly. "About what?" "That kindness doesn't erase pain," Daniel replied. "But it changes what the pain can do." Arthur's eyes shone. "Then my job here is done." "Not even close," Daniel said. "You started something. I'm not stopping." They worked side by side that night, not saying much. They didn't need to. Daniel understood now that kindness beyond pain wasn't a single moment or a dramatic turning point. It was a series of small, steady choices, to show up, to care, to keep going even when it hurt. Months later, Emily walked into the kitchen on unsteady legs, her arm looped through Daniel's. The volunteers applauded as if she were a hero, and maybe she was. She looked around, confused but smiling. "What is this place?" she asked. Daniel squeezed her hand. "It's where everything changed." He didn't mean the accident. He meant the bench in the rain. The stranger who listened. The invitation he almost refused. One act of kindness that rippled outward, touching lives he might never fully know. Pain would always be part of his story. Loss, fear, uncertainty, they didn't vanish. But kindness had gone beyond the pain, reaching into the broken places and building something new there. And in that quiet, powerful way, it had changed everything.